My name is Quill Taylor, and I have taken it upon myself to record my findings pertaining to the life of a young boy named Anthony Todd. This is Quill Taylor recording entry number 5, written on my 6th day in Moorgrove. Entry begins. It's early. I've just woken up and everything's come back in a rush. Everything I've learned since yesterday, everything I still have questions about. Let me start from where I left off. The woman across the street. Right after I stopped writing, I went down to meet her. She was in fact the woman from the manor, and she was much more intimidating up close than far away. Her hair pulled back tightly, and her eyes once again covered by dark glasses. While having an older presence, she did not appear to be over 40, though I was not so rude to ask about her age. I invited her in quite easily, despite my confusion over why she'd come to visit, or how she knew where my flat was in the first place. That had been my first question when she came inside, standing politely in the doorway until I invited her to come sit down. Her answer was quite simple and vague, though I suppose it made sense. She told me she asked some of the people living around me. It was still a bit unsettling, but most of my discomfort was replaced by curiosity. She was nothing if not graceful and precise. Her posture was stiff and poised as she sat, not unakin to a snake preparing to strike. Her movements were careful and slow, as if each had been planned and carried out. It was a tad disconcerting and made me more than self-conscious about the state of my flat. Still, she seemed tolerable enough, though the most prominent thought in my mind had unsurprisingly been our first encounter. But I managed to convince myself that the only way to resolve questions is to get close to the person who can answer them. So I allowed her to stay and managed to push aside some of these pressing matters for long enough to act like a proper host and offer her something to drink. After making tea, there was a length of silence. It was rather uncomfortable for me, but the woman easily asked me if I'd noticed anything odd during my time here. Not very subtle and straight to the point. I was almost relieved at the lack of small talk beforehand. I don't think I could have handled another surreal conversation about the weather. I answered yes, of course. As I've been documenting here, the strange things I've observed continued to be a growing concern. It was quite relieving to know my concerns had not been unwarranted. She explains that yes, the town is quite strange to outsiders, though they quickly get over it after a few days. I find myself nodding, knowing the patterns this town seems to inspire the development of. Changing the subject, she observes straight away that I've checked out some of the books from the library. Unsurprising, as they are laying quite evidently on my kitchen counter. It was odd to hear someone mention them, as I realised no one on the street had asked about history of Moorgrove as I'd been walking around. As soon as I mentioned the title, though, the woman stiffened and possibly more. Her response was hesitant, and she refused to take the book when I handed it to her. She told me it was important that I return it to the library as soon as possible. I asked her why, not quite inclined to do as she had near demanded of me. She was hesitant to answer, and suffice it to say, her answer was not helpful in the slightest. She told me that it may be necessary, and that it shouldn't even be out of the library in the first place. She seemed convinced that it shouldn't have been in the library in the first place. After a bit of tense silence, her serious tone had shocked me more than I would like to admit. I put the book aside and mentioned that I'd take it back later on. It didn't seem to satisfy her, but it was enough to continue the conversation. She asked me what else I've noticed around town. To my surprise, she pulls out a small pocket notebook and a pen, as if she's going to write down my answers. Somehow even more surprising, that's exactly what she does. I tell her about my neighbour, and how the people in the town always seem to say and do the same things every day. I mentioned that I noticed it in myself, and had been trying to get out of starting a habit. She seemed equal parts shocked and intrigued by this, asking me when I had first noticed it, and why I didn't just give in. It didn't feel accusatory, and I found myself telling her all that I could. She was easy to talk to once I started. She never wasted time on sounds of acknowledgement, and seemed to know exactly what she was going to ask next. While I stumbled over my words, she glided across hers. She mainly avoided eye contact, jotting things in her notepad and asking more questions. Mainly, she wanted to know how I'd come here, and how I noticed all of these things. Eventually, she stopped asking me questions long enough that I could ask her one of my own. I brought up Anthony, mentioning where I'd seen her previously and wondering why he'd appeared to be the only child in town. How did she come to know him? I didn't ask about her voice in my head. I'm still a bit doubtful that it even happened. Immediately, mentioning Anthony appeared to be a mistake. However, upon a few moments of silence, I realized that she was merely thinking about what to say, something she hadn't done since she'd arrived. Her answer was a bit clipped, and I didn't get much information other than the fact that she is his nanny, and that she'd raised him from birth. She made it very clear that Anthony was her responsibility, and if anything were to happen to him, she'd be the first to know. By her gaze, I knew I didn't want to be one on the receiving end of her anger. I changed the subject quickly, drawing back to my neighbour, specifically their reaction to my inquiries about a computer. She nodded, explaining briefly that technology developed within the last 2 centuries or so doesn't work well within Moorgrove. Cars, telephones, recording devices, and such things have not been seen in town for a while, and aren't likely to show up anytime soon. She offers no explanation on the reaction I received, and brushes it off as a minor concern. She asked about my novel then, how important it is to me. I explained that this project is very important to me, and why would I have moved all the way here if it wasn't? She went silent then, giving me a bit of a pitying look. I was taken aback when she asked me if I want to know how to leave. Now, despite the fact that it should have been, leaving was not a major concern on my mind. I had taken the bus here, and I could certainly take the bus back home. But after a moment, I recalled that there had been no departure time for leaving the town. The driver had mentioned that there was one, but didn't specify. It must have shown on my face, because the woman eased my fears quite quickly, saying that yes, the bus does leave town despite there never being anyone on it when it does, and that I can leave town if I'd like. Actually, she'd been very adamant about my leaving town. Not in an impolite way, as I would have expected, given our only previous interaction, but her voice held more concern. She told me that I'd be able to leave in a way that sounded like no one else could. This apparently is the case as far as she knew, but she told me something was different about me and was very confident that I'd be able to. She did tell me that if I left, I wouldn't find my way back. If I left, it would be permanent, so I'd better pack all my things away. I apparently would forget this place ever existed. I would return to the last familiar place I'd been before beginning my journey, and forget that I'd even wanted to move here at all. It gave me chills, I won't lie. Sounded straight out of a cheesy horror film or something similar. I pondered it for a moment, though, enlightening her, even though quite honestly not believing it. But her tone and her expression were deadly serious. Part of me believes it now, after thinking about it. Even as I begin my day, I feel the now familiar seedlings of habit trying to get me to repeat yesterday's events, however impossible that may be. So why wouldn't more impossible things suddenly seem possible? The bus leaves Moorgrove late at night, near 11 o'clock. She told me she'd be able to help me leave if that's what I wished to do, and she made it very clear that I should leave. This is not the place for you, she had said, and I know she's correct. But I'm so curious now. Not only why Moorgrove is so strange, and how these clearly supernatural circumstances seem to be commonplace for the people living here, but about how much this woman knows. She seemed as confused as I was about some things, but I recognize a researcher, and I'm sure I'm right in suspecting her of having a hand in all of this. I don't know. Honestly, the thing I'm finding the hardest to believe is how easily I've accepted all of this. My next step should be getting out of this town and forgetting all of it. That's what I expected to consider first. But, if I'm being truthful, I want to stay. I want to know what's going on, and I want to be a part of whatever strange corner of this planet I've landed myself in. That woman, Abby, as she was leaving, she told me to go to the manor tomorrow, well, today, and tell her my decision. I don't think she'll like it, but if she's in a similar situation as me, and she's farther along, I'm willing to help her research in whatever way I can. Who knows? This might make a great story. Entry ends. It's clear what I chose to do, and I am quite fortunate that Abby was so willing to allow me to aid in her sleuthing. She's been keeping things from me still, which I really must talk to her about. But we've gotten somewhere. The cave should be a good lead, expecting we find something of substance while exploring, and I have been compiling a list of places I want to look into, the library taking the top spot. I think I should try to take this device with me when we go back into the tunnels. It would be good to have an audio recording of the exploration, so that if something happens, well, there's a record of it somewhere. I don't care how much Abby thinks it won't work. I'm willing to try. That's all I have for now. Until next time. End recording. The Domestic Life of Anthony Todd is a podcast written and recorded by J.R. Steele and licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 international license. The audio is edited using Audacity, the free editing program. Thanks for joining me.